All right, hello. Looks like we have a few participants. My name is Inney Prakesh. I'm a cinema programmer at Maysles Documentary Center, which is a nonprofit screening and education venue in Harlem. Normally, we screen documentaries all year round and have education programs for youth in Harlem and the South Bronx. Obviously, we are virtual right now, which is not ideal, but what is ideal in this current world? We have a lot of virtual screenings planned, so glad you're able to join us for Slay the Dragon. Make sure you put on your calendar Earth, which will be available next week. And then also No Data Plan and Work Songs with a Q&A with Philip Lopate and Mark Street will be coming up. We can go ahead and get started now. I'd like to introduce the directors of Slay the Dragon. We have Barak Goodman, who has become, over the course of 20 years and more than 30 films, one of the most prolific and acclaimed nonfiction filmmakers in America, bracketed by the Academy Award-nominated Scottsboro, An American Tragedy, and the Emmy Award-nominated Sundance hit Oklahoma City. Goodman's films have explored the greatness, turbulence, and moral complexity of American life. And Chris Durrance has worked on more than a dozen films for PBS's Frontline, including College Inc. about for-profit education, The Madoff Affair, and Return of the Taliban. He has worked all over the world, including Europe, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and China, and is the winner of a Peabody, 2 Emmys, a DuPont Columbia Silver Baton, and an Overseas Press Club Award. He has worked with Barak previously on Clinton, the 4-hour presidential biography for PBS's American Experience, which aired in February 2012. And the two have reteamed for this extraordinary expose of gerrymandering, Slay the Dragon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us. Thanks very much.
I guess we can get started by asking why gerrymandering? I believe it was a book that turned you on.
It was, but more than that, it was a quest. I think it's fair to say, to understand our politics. This was started back in 2016 when the polarization and the enmity and the sort of bitterness in our politics was just, it hadn't reached a crescendo yet, but it was certainly on the upslope. And I and Chris were looking for a way to understand that beyond the surface level. What was driving this? What structural issues were there that was driving this polarization? And why our politicians had become so inured to the will of the people in some ways. And yes, I encountered this book by David Daley. It's called Rat Fucked, believe it or not. And it's an amazing piece of reporting about gerrymandering, which was a subject I knew very little about, but he unpacked and really exposed a concerted campaign by the Republican Party to gerrymander much of the country. And in so doing, to create an impregnable wall between themselves and voters. And that explained a lot to me about what was going on. And I said to Chris, and Chris agreed that this was a great subject for a film. And we were off and running.
That's extraordinary. And how did you begin? How did you two begin working together initially? You had done the previous film.
Oh, Chris, you should be on mute.
I'm muted. Sorry about that. We have a lot of mutual friends in the New York documentary world. I've worked for a company called Rain Media with great filmmakers, Martin Smith and Marcelo Gaviria, and they're old friends of Barak and his wife Rachel, also a fantastic filmmaker. So it was just a sort of a wonderful team that I grew up in and learned a lot from. And an opportunity came up a while back now, I think 10 years ago now, to do a film on Bill Clinton's presidency for PBS. And Barak asked me to join the team, and we've worked on many films since. And this has been one of our most rewarding. It really has.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's wonderful that you went beyond Project Red Map and got in the trenches with some of the efforts to battle gerrymandering today. And I was wondering what was the process of getting in touch with and then beginning to film both Katie Fahey and then Ruth Goodman and her team.
Ruth Greenwood, yeah. So
Greenwood, sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. We knew we wanted to focus essentially on 3 states: Wisconsin, Michigan, and North Carolina, where the gerrymandering had been particularly egregious. The results were particularly skewed. And there was great stories in these states of how this had been done. And most importantly, there were people fighting back. In the case of Wisconsin, there was a court case that we were going to be able to follow the Supreme Court. That was pretty clear. It was going to go to the Supreme Court. And it was brought by this married couple, Ruth Greenwood and her husband, Nick Stephanopoulos. Great characters, passionate people, brilliant people who had worked out an argument that would, they thought, prevail in the Supreme Court. So we were going to watch and see if that happened. And then we wanted a grassroots campaign. We wanted to see ordinary people banding together, using democracy to save democracy, essentially. And we found this amazing character in Michigan, this young woman, you mentioned her, Katie Fahey. At the time, I think she was 27 when we first met her, 29, something like that. Never had worked in politics, never done anything in politics, but was outraged by this practice, started with a Facebook post, and within several months had built a campaign of thousands of people in Michigan, fighting the entrenched interests there, fighting this improbable fight. And we were along for the ride almost from the very beginning. And it just one of those fortuitous, serendipitous things where a filmmaker gets in with a person, a character, and a set of characters very early on, and can really watch something unfold over the course of time. And it was just a thrilling adventure for all of us.
What was I like? I wonder, you spoke also to a couple people who had been part of the gerrymandering effort. And it struck me in particular that Chris Jankowski, when interviewed, sounded not just unashamed, but very proud of his work. Did that shock you? What was that like?
Dave Daly, for his book, had interviewed Chris, and we knew that for our film, we wanted to speak to him as well. And so we shot him an email, wrote pretty much right back, sure, come down to Virginia and let's meet. I'm happy to talk. And he is proud of what he did. And what he did will go down in history as one of the great political coups, really, in American history. I mean, for $30 million, which is chump change in the context of American politics, he took control of numerous states for the best part of a decade, and the lower chamber of Congress, again, for the best part of a decade. I mean, it was genius what he did. So he's rightly proud of that. Deep down, this doesn't really come across so much in the film, but deep down, personally, I think we both sense there's a little bit of remorse. Not much. I think he would probably do it all over again, given the chance. You know, it's a bit of a game, and he feels like he outsmarted Democrats, and he won, and he did. I mean, you can't take that away from him. He really did. But I think people have to understand that what he did is unring in American history. I mean, both sides have done it for a long time, but he really weaponized it. He federalized it, he weaponized it, and it's pernicious. And it's taken now to a level where it really is a threat to a democracy. And that's why we wanted to tell that story, but also tell the story, as Barak said, of the fight back.
It's interesting, I'll just add to that we interviewed several of the gerrymanderers, particularly on the Republican side. And what strikes you is how inured they are to the consequences of their own actions. As Chris said, it is a game to them. And I think this speaks to our politics and what it's become, particularly to this class of unelected, paid political, I'll call them political hacks, who don't feel a responsibility to the voters, particularly. They want to win, as Chris said. And it's very corrosive to the democracy. And I think it was very dismaying for us to sit across from them, talk to them, and hear their justifications, their lies, frankly, not so much Chris, but several others, and their sort of cynicism about the political process. It was really, we understood better than we could in an abstract way, how this all happens. It's because people don't really think about the consequences for the broader democracy of what they're doing. They just want to win.
Yeah, and what's so painful about it, really, as Barak said, is it renders elections fundamentally pretty irrelevant in most cases. You take Wisconsin, and for 10 years, in 3 of the elections in the last 10 years, Democrats have run Republicans significantly. 2012, 2016, and then just recently in the 2018 elections. You can't win a majority in that state legislature. They barely win an extra seat after what Chris Jankowski basically masterminded in that state. It's utterly corrosive, and it's because of, as Barak said, because of these consultants in secret wielding this power before a vote is even cast. It's disgusting.
Absolutely. Looks like we have a few questions from the audience here. The first one, okay, so you touched on this a bit, but how did you?
Sorry, missed that. Say that again, please.
Sorry. The question was, how did you select the various experts? I guess some of them had been interviewed in the book to speak on the film, and were there other voices you wish you could have featured but were unable to?
Good question. You know, we try to go to those people who've been working in this field for a long time. We didn't use a ton of experts because we wanted people who were actively in the game fighting, but those who we did talk to, including David Daley, Ari Berman, Justin Levitt, people like that, have been focused on this for years, decades, and really know it in a deep way. And they were perhaps the most articulate people to talk about this. We did want to talk to several people we couldn't talk to. Tom Hoffler is foremost among them. He's dead now, but at the time we sought an interview with him. He is the grand architect of gerrymandering, and perhaps in a way embodies why it's so, so cynical more than anyone. For years, Tom Hoffler, who drew a lot of the lines or consulted with those who drew the lines, claimed that he didn't have any partisan goals in mind at all, that this was just best practices that he was operating in. And then he died, and then his daughter released files that were on his hard drive that showed exactly the opposite, that he had used partisan considerations all from the word go, and that he had used race, separating Black and white people intentionally in order not to discriminate against Black people, but to discriminate against Democrats. And this was proof that those protestations to the contrary had been lies. And we wanted to be able to confront him. He's a very affable, nice guy, old grandfatherly guy. He resisted it, and we weren't able ultimately to talk to him. So I think he more than anyone is someone we wish we had talked to.
Yeah, somebody mentioned wish we could have heard from his daughter. That's pretty dramatic, outing your father's evil intentions after he's died.
Yeah.
The video you did feature of him was pretty disturbing. It gave me some serious Robert Durst energy, where he's just sort of looking at the camera.
That was a deposition, but yeah, it was hard to find any images of him. He's a very careful guy, but yeah, that one had a certain pungency, didn't it?
So we got a couple questions on feedback here. One is, has the film been met with any partisan criticism?
I think for most people, they have a sense that this is something, and we see this in Michigan particularly clearly, this is something that actually cuts across party lines, or it should cut across party lines. When you look at how Katie did, she outperformed all the Democrats in that election. She won in pretty much every county in Michigan. It's a topic, and I feel like whenever you dig into it, in blue states, in purple states, in red states, you see how well it polls. And it's a topic that I think appeals across party lines because people see, when they understand what's going on, when they understand that fundamentally it's about rigging the rules of the game before an election has even taken place, they understand that that is fundamentally wrong. And however much we might disagree on substance, on policy, rigging the rules, in effect cheating, stealing elections, keeping onto power when you should by rights be being voted out of office is just wrong, and it's corrosive, and it's bad for our democracy. And sadly, we're living with the political consequences of that in this decade. We hope not in the next decade, but it's entirely possible, because in many states, these elections are being run on those gerrymandered maps that we describe in the film that were basically instituted in 2011. A lot of people don't realize that, but we're not fighting these elections on a level playing field. In many states, it's biased from the get-go.
You know, we faced a dilemma, Chris and I, because we don't want to be partisan. It wasn't a partisan film. We're not here to say one side is smarter or better than the other. But we faced a situation, and both sides historically have done this. But we faced as we reported the story, it was quite clear that one of the two political parties had decided, thought up, dreamed up the scheme to use gerrymandering as a national political weapon. So when you're confronted with that fact, do you run away from it because you're trying to avoid seeming to be partisan? No, if you're journalists, you tell the story as it is. And we're not saying that the Democrats are more virtuous than the Republicans. In fact, we're quite concerned that in those states that Democrats now have control, such as Virginia, that they not do the same thing to Republicans that Republicans did to them. Our concern is that gerrymandering has to end, whoever's doing it. And it just so happens that in the last decade, the Republicans have done it. We don't want either party to do it. I think I'm speaking for Chris as well. And I think that's the passion of the film. The people in the film all say this, whether they're whatever side of the political aisle they're on. It's about stopping this practice.
Great.
Yeah, we'd have been ducking. Yeah, we'd have been ducking. As Barak said, we'd have been ducking the issue if we'd gone for both sidism on this particular story. It's just. It's as Dave Daly says in the film. I mean, the Republicans took gerrymandering into its steroids era in 2011. You just have to call it. You just have to call it out for what it is.
Somebody is asking, isn't the Electoral College system itself the first, perhaps unintended instance of gerrymandering? I wonder what you think of that, and if the Electoral College system has come up and its fairness in any of your research or reporting.
It has, and I would agree with your caller. I think it's an artifact of a political compromise from a long time ago. It doesn't make much sense. It's certainly not reflective of the will of the people. And there are a lot of these kind of leftover artifacts. The Senate itself, for example, why does the two Dakotas have 4 senators and California have 2 and New York have 2? We know why, because there were, in the drafting of the Constitution and the formulation of our government, this was a necessary compromise. But the Electoral College has probably outlived its usefulness, and there are many smart, articulate, very intelligent people calling for its end. It's a very hard, push, because they're vested interests who like it the way it is. But I would agree. I think it is a generally corrosive artifact of another era that is, anti-democratic, frankly.
Yeah, it may well become untenable. I mean, if you get a succession of elections in which a president is elected on the basis of a minority of the popular vote, and mathematically it can be quite large numbers. I mean, I think the last was 2.8, 2.9 million votes, that fewer votes that Trump had over Hillary Clinton in the last election. But I think mathematically you can get significantly more, a significantly greater deficit and still win the presidential election. That happens too often. I think just it becomes untenable and collapses. Frankly, I hope so. I mean, it's the population shifts have made it ridiculous. The same with the representation in the Senate. But there are fixes. I mean, Washington D.C., for example, Puerto Rico. I mean, there are various things that can redress some of the imbalance in the Senate slightly more easily than with the Electoral College.
Have you gotten feedback from your audiences as to whether how the film helped them understand the subject? People who are saying, "Oh, I had no idea what this was or how it worked."
That's the most gratifying thing about it, is that that's been a near universal response. Is that the film does a great job of kind of explaining this somewhat wonky subject in very clear and even entertaining ways, and goes beyond that to show you know, it's a very dramatic story, and in ways, it's a very inspiring story. I mean, we have, you know, lots of intrigue and suspense in the story, and we have characters who are reclaiming our democracy in wonderful ways and showing the resilience of our democracy. The takeaway from this film for me is not how hopeless it is and how screwed we are, but how ordinary people can do so much with just their passion and their commitment. I mean, because our democracy is essentially resilient and has lots of tools available to people, it's still possible to move the needle just with your own passion. I mean, Katie Fahey is a person that has inspired, I think, nearly everyone who's seen the film, and, you know, is a real hero, an ordinary person who took things into her own hands and changed the world. And that ultimately, for me, is the great takeaway from the film.
Yeah, I think Barak agrees that she'll go on to do great things. I mean, she's already set up a national organization. So she's partnering with Voters Not Politicians still in Michigan, but she set up a national organization called The People. And we should continue to watch her, because she's just, there's something about her. And you see that arc in the course of the film, actually. You see her grow. We joined her, as Barak said earlier, we joined her near the beginning of this campaign. And by the end, you see someone who's so eloquent and so articulate and just is such a great leader, such an inspiring leader. I mean, just brought all these people together, people with many of them, all these volunteers, no political experience themselves, like her, no background in organizing and activism and fundraising. And she helped them find abilities that they didn't even necessarily realize that they had, and galvanized them. And she's now trying to do that on a national scale, and I bet she will.
Yeah, she's extraordinarily inspiring. Someone is asking about stopping the practice. So of course we have these ballot referendums where independent commissions are created. What is the right way to draw the map so that they're not gerrymandered in terms of the conversations these people will then be having about how to redraw them?
We think the best practice is these independent commissions of citizens, so that politicians who have a vested interest in their own maps aren't given the right to draw them. Ordinary citizens are. It's not difficult to draw fair maps. Children can do it. Basically, what you're trying to do is create compact, geographically sane boundaries. If you just take politics out of it, it's not that hard to do. And we've seen that in states over and over again that have instituted these reforms, like California, Arizona, Iowa, and others, that the maps end up much more fair. And now Pennsylvania by court order had to redraw its maps. North Carolina by court order had to redraw its maps. So courts are getting involved, not the Supreme Court. The federal courts have washed their hands of this. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court has said we don't belong in this fight, which was a terrible decision. But the state courts in many states have said, nonsense, this is not fair. We have a role to play, and we're going to force our state legislatures to draw sane and fair maps. And in many states, that's happening. So our feeling is that, as far as your viewers are concerned, everybody's got a role to play to keep the pressure on, to shine a light on this practice, because it can't survive if it's known. People are so disgusted by it that if people know it's happening, it won't survive. So the key is to keep awareness of this subject up. That's what we hope our film will do, the book, and citizen activism, most importantly, can shine a light on this practice so that people are not going behind doors and rigging the game, as Chris said earlier, to their own benefit.
What's one thing that's really interesting, Katie actually did, you'll see at the beginning of the film, she does a Facebook post about gerrymandering and asks who will join. And there's just a flood of messages in 2016. She had recently, Facebook generated some timeline where it sort of took her back into her previous posts. And it turned out, and she'd actually forgotten this, it turned out that about 2 or 3 years earlier, she'd done exactly the same post and got 0 response. So it just shows that there's just this sort of national upswell of frustration with where our politics is at, and a wish to do something. And it just needs that little spark for it to take off. And what's exciting is you look at many states, unexpected states, Ohio, Oklahoma, Wyoming, all trying to do something about this. It's not just the sort of traditional, the states where you might think the battle's the most fierce or the stakes are highest, like Pennsylvania and North Carolina and the Midwestern states, the battleground states there. Just a lot of people are increasingly fed up with how disconnected, how arrogant so many of our politicians have become. And it's all enabled by gerrymandering. So just this nationwide, we hope it becomes this nationwide movement. It's going to have to be different in every state. You can't do a ballot initiative in every state. State constitutions are different. So each state is going to require a different path. But as Barak said, the passion is there, the will is there, and hopefully we can just gradually push this politics, push this into the past, because it's so corrosive.
The other thing I want to say is, and I hope our film accomplishes this, is that it's very important for people to understand the connections here, that gerrymandering is just at the heart of a whole complex of efforts to suppress voting. So they're not disconnected, they're actually intimately connected. Voter ID laws, polling place shenanigans, voting hours, it's all of a piece. It's the same people doing it. It's the same money behind it. And we draw those lines and make people understand that voter suppression is a national strategy, because one party doesn't believe that it can survive, and now the president has said so explicitly, if we have fair elections. And so this is all preconceived, well executed, and if we care about fair elections, and I hope people do, and the idea of one person, one vote, and all votes count the same, we have to understand that this is a national plan, and we have to get in there and stop it. And I think that is happening, as Chris said. People are disgusted. Republicans and Democrats don't like this. And I do think we're at a tipping point right now, and I think we're going to hear more and more about this going forward. And we hope that when it comes around 2021 to redraw the maps again, they can't get away with it this time.
Right, and maybe to wrap up, speaking of this time, so it is 2020, it's a census year, where I know several states have instituted reforms. New York, I think, had a referendum in 2014. But where's the battle now? Have you been following the process as it ramps up this time?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, there's a nationwide movement, and Katie actually is at the heart of trying to change things. But as I said before, it's going to require different measures in different states. The tragedy of the Supreme Court bowing out of this and pulling all federal courts out of this is twofold. Firstly, just on the face of it, we would have had a reform that applied in every state. So that would have been fantastic. That would have changed the game overnight. The second thing, I think, which I think is less appreciated, by taking the federal courts out of the picture, out of the game, a lot of the information that we've uncovered, a lot of the secret information that these gerrymanderers relied on to carry out their nefarious acts is going to remain hidden. They only came out because federal courts ordered these things released. You know, these people are incredibly careful to keep everything they do secret because they know how toxic it is. They know how bad what they're doing is. Federal courts were able, there was a period when they were ordering the release of this information. By taking the courts out, federal courts out of this, I think we'll lose access to a lot of information about how terrible this is. So the onus is even more strongly on us as citizens to shine a light on this practice, to answer the census, to fill out a census form, to encourage our friends and neighbors to fill out a census form, first off. And then second, in the spring of next year, when the redistricting starts happening in states, to get involved, to go to hearings, to make sure that there are hearings, to hold politicians' feet to the fire. And then where there are avenues through state constitutions, through ballot initiatives to make change. Arkansas has one coming up. Let's get involved in that. Oklahoma, Wyoming. I mean, there are lots of places where there are initiatives, and it's hard because of the pandemic, but we can all help them get past and then get involved in our own states where reform is so desperately needed.
There's a group called All on the Line, led by Eric Holder, the former Attorney General. which is totally focused on this issue. So if people out there are really incensed by this, that's one place to go. But there are many others as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Barak. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you're able and interested, please head to maysles.org and check out our future programming. We also appreciate any donations you're able to give at this time. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy and at home. And yeah, thanks again for jumpstarting this important conversation.
Thanks so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. That was great.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Be well.